On this question, it is saying, here's a function, find f inverse of -1. So notice this is, this is the inverse f -1, right? So we got to find the inverse. So how do we find an inverse function? Because that's what we're being asked to do here. And if you go to the notes, here's exam 2 notes. To find the inverse function of a function, step 1, invert or switch x and y. Note, f of x is the same as y. So first step, so this is really y, and we're supposed to switch the x's with the y's. So step 1, switch or invert x and y. So, okay, so that'll become, so this is, y out there, it'll become x, right? This, I'm going to switch equals y plus 2 over y plus 7. See what happened there? So these x's became y's, and this f of x, which is y, became x. Switch x and y. That's what inverse function means, an inverting of x and y. Step 2, solve for y. It's got a lot of parts to it, but that is the second step. Solve for y. So I got to solve this little equation here for y. Put this wall down the center. So basically, here's the deal. Y is over here saying, I want to be alone, Get rid of all this stuff. Well, how are we going to solve this equation to get y alone? First off, notice we have a fraction. What do we always do with a fraction? We multiply by the denominator over 1 on both sides, and this cross cancels. And so we get y plus 2. And here, this will distribute. So we'll get xy plus 7x. Okay. Now, notice the problem at this point. We have y in 2 locations. In fact, let me circle. Well, I'll just unblock this and this. We have y in 2 spots. What do you do? Let me write some steps. When y is in 2 spots, which again we need to do, is first, A, get the y's on the same side. How do I get them on the same side? Well, I'm just going to jump this term over there, and then I'm going to jump this term right there. So then that'll give us x, y. When things jump to the other side, they switch signs, right? Become -y. This will be -7x plus 2. See what I did there? So basically, really, I did a shortcut because I could have just subtracted y from both sides, right? That would have got rid of this and put -y on the left side. See how that works? Basically, when we want to move something to the other side, we do the opposite of it, right? This is a y, so I subtract y. That gets rid of it. But whatever we do to one side, I got to do to the other. So you see how the regular y ends up being a -y on the other side. And then same thing with the 7x. Want to get rid of that 7x? Subtract 7x from both sides. Gets rid of it here and ends up being -7x on the other side. So basically, when we do the adding, subtracting things to move things around, all the items end up just jumping. Like this y jumps to the other side, becomes a -y. This plus 7x jumps to the other side, becomes a -7x. Because, I subtracted 7x from both sides to get rid of this. And so it's opposite on the other side. Same thing with the y. I subtracted y to get rid of that from both sides. It's up -y on the other side. So long story short, to save time and writing, I just jump them to the other side and they switch signs, right? Plus 7x jumps over, becomes -7x. Positive y jumps over, becomes -y. Okay, so get the y's on the same side there. So both these y's are now on the same side. And then b, we got to get it 1 point factor out y with a parenthesis. In other words, I'm going to go y parenthesis. And then how do you know what goes in the parentheses? Well, whatever works. Y times x and y times -1, right? If you were to distribute this y times x, you go right back to xy. Order doesn't matter. Y times -1 is -y. That's called factoring. It's reverse multiplying, right? And why does that work? Why is that helpful? Because now y is in just one spot. Now we're just one step away. Factor out y. I'll just say, oops, we'll change the color here. Thought I did. There we go. And so I'll just, now I can just divide by the x minus 1. Boom, boom. Like so. And that gives me y equals minus 7x plus 2 over x minus 1. Is that making sense? So the trick there, so from the beginning, so we're trying to find the inverse function. We invert, this y and x is switched. These become y's, this becomes an x. Then you get rid of the denominator. You multiply both sides by that. Distribute it here. Here it cancels. Then we got y in two places. What do you do with that? Jump the y's over here to be on the same side. Factor out the y. Divided by the x minus 1. Okay, but we're not done. This is the inverse function. This right here. This is the inverse function. We have one more little step. This is the inverse function, but they didn't just say find the inverse function of x. They could have. But they didn't just say that. What did they say? Find the inverse function and plug in -1. You see, that's what this is saying. Right here, this is the inverse function with -1 plugged in. So we found the inverse function. Now, plug in x is -1 to the inverse function, right? They want f inverse of -1. The inverse function of -1. So I take this, I'm going to put a -1 right there and a -1 right there. So I get -7 times -1 plus 2. Oops. What's happening with my color changer? Plus 2 over -1 minus 1. So it's plugged in -1 to the inverse function. That's what they're saying from the beginning. They said, hey, here's a regular function. Find the inverse and then plug in -1. So I did all this work of switching x and y and solving for y. Found the inverse. Now take that inverse and now plug in -1. And let's see what we get. We get that 7 plus 2 over -2. Right? And that's going to be 9 over -2. Divide that in your calculator. You can leave it a decimal fraction. I'll just divide it -4.5. There we go. So this was 2 phases to this problem. Phase 1, because they wanted the inverse function with -1 plugged in. So I took the original function, did all the work here to find the inverse function, switch an x and y, solve for y. Then I had the inverse function. Then I had to plug in -1 for x to the inverse function, work it out, got -4.5. And so there we go.